he said to the elder. "I'll lend you a hand." The little fellows nudged each other. The gamin frightened and inspired them with confidence at one and the same time. And then it was raining very hard. The elder one undertook the risk. The younger, on seeing his brother climbing up, and himself left alone between the paws of this huge beast, felt greatly inclined to cry, but he did not dare. The elder lad climbed, with uncertain steps, up the rungs of the ladder, Gavroche, in the meanwhile, encouraging him with exclamations like a fencing master to his pupils, or a muleteer to his mules. "Don't be afraid. That's it. Come on, put your feet there. Give us your hand here. Boldly." And when the child was within reach, he seized him suddenly and vigorously by the arm, and pulled him towards him. "Nabbed," said he. The brat had passed through the crack. "Now," said Gavroche, "wait for me. Be so good as to take a seat, monsieur." And making his way out of the hole, as he had entered it, he slipped down the elephant's leg with the agility of a monkey, landed on his feet in the grass, grasped the child of 5 round the body, and planted him fairly in the middle of the ladder. Then he began to climb up behind him, shouting to the elder:— "I'm going to boost him. Do you tug." And in another instant, the small lad was pushed, dragged, pulled, thrust, stuffed into the hole, before he had time to recover himself, and Gavroche, entering behind him, and repulsing the ladder with a kick which sent it flat on the grass, began to clap his hands and to cry:— "Here we are! Long live General Lafayette!" This explosion over, he added:— "Now, young 'uns, you are in my house." Gavroche was at home, in fact. Oh, unforeseen utility of the useless, charity of great things, goodness of giants! This huge monument, which had embodied an idea of the Emperor's, had become the box of a street urchin. The brat had been accepted and sheltered by the colossus. The bourgeois, decked out in their Sunday finery, who passed the elephant of the Bastille, were fond of saying, as they scanned it disdainfully with their prominent eyes: "What's the good of that?" It served to save from the cold, the frost, the hail, the rain, to shelter from the winds of winter, to preserve from slumber in the mud which produces fever, and from slumber in the snow which produces death, a little being who had no father, no mother, no bread, no clothes, no refuge. It served to receive the innocent, whom society repulsed. It served to diminish public crime. It was a lair open to one against whom all doors were shut. It seemed as though the miserable old mastodon, invaded by vermin and oblivion, covered with warts, with mould and ulcers, tottering, worm-eaten, abandoned, condemned, a sort of mendicant colossus, asking alms in vain, with a benevolent look in the midst of the cross-roads, had taken pity on that other mendicant, the poor pygmy, who roamed without shoes to his feet, without a roof over his head, blowing on his fingers, clad in rags, fed on rejected scraps. That was what the elephant of the Bastille was good for. This idea of Napoleon, disdained by men, had been taken back by God. That which had been merely illustrious had become august. In order to realize his thought, the Emperor should have had porphyry, brass, iron, gold, marble. The old collection of planks, beams, and plaster sufficed for God. The Emperor had had the dream of a genius, in that titanic elephant, armed, prodigious, with trunk uplifted, bearing its tower and scattering on all sides its merry and vivifying waters. He wished to incarnate the people. God had done a grander thing with it. He had lodged a child there. The hole through which Gavroche had entered was a breach which was hardly visible from the outside, being concealed, as we have stated, beneath the elephant's belly, and so narrow that it was only cats and homeless children who could pass through it. "Let's begin," said Gavroche, "by telling the porter that we are not at home." And plunging into the darkness with the assurance of a person who is well acquainted with his apartments, he took a plank and stopped up the aperture. Again Gavroche plunged into the obscurity. The children heard the crackling of the match thrust into the phosphoric bottle. The chemical match was not yet in existence. At that epoch, the fumade steel represented progress. A sudden light made them blink. Gavroche had just managed to ignite one of those bits of cord dipped in resin which are called cellar rats. The cellar rat, which emitted more smoke than light, rendered the interior of the elephant confusedly visible. Gavroche's two guests glanced about them, and the sensation which they experienced was something like that which one would feel if shut up in the great tun of Heidelberg, or, better still, like what Jonah must have felt in the biblical belly of the whale. An entire and gigantic skeleton appeared enveloping them. Above, a long brown beam, whence started at regular distances massive, arching ribs, represented the vertebral column with its sides. Stalactites of plaster depended from them like entrails, and vast spiders' webs stretching from side to side formed dirty diaphragms. Here and there, in the corners, were visible large blackish spots, which had the appearance of being alive, and which changed places rapidly with an abrupt and frightened movement. Fragments which had fallen from the elephant's back into his belly had filled up the cavity, so that it was possible to walk upon it as on a floor. The smaller child nestled up against his brother, and whispered to him, "It's black." This remark drew an exclamation from Gavroche. The petrified air of the two brats rendered some shock necessary. "What's that you're gabbling about there?" he exclaimed. "Are you scoffing at me? Are you turning up your noses? Do you want the Tuileries? Are you brutes? Come, say. I warn you that I don't belong to the regiment of simpletons. Ah, come now, are you brats from the Pope's establishment?" A little roughness is good in cases of fear. It is reassuring. The two children drew close to Gavroche. Gavroche, paternally touched by this confidence, passed from grave to gentle, and addressing the smaller, "Stupid," said he, accenting the insulting word with a caressing intonation. "It's outside that it is black. Outside it's raining. Here it does not rain. Outside it's cold. Here there's not an atom of wind. Outside there are heaps of people. Here there's no one. Outside there ain't even the moon. Here there's my candle, confound it." The two children began to look upon the apartment with less terror, but Gavroche allowed them no more time for contemplation. "Quick," said he, and he pushed them towards what they were very glad to be able to call the end of the room. There stood his bed. Gavroche's bed was complete, that is to say, it had a mattress, a blanket, and an alcove with curtains. The mattress was a straw mat, the blanket a rather large strip of grey woollen stuff, very warm and almost new. This is what the alcove consisted of. Three rather long poles, thrust into and consolidated with the rubbish which formed the floor, that is to say, the belly of the elephant, two in front and one behind, and united by a rope at their summits, so as to form a pyramidal bundle. This cluster supported a trellis work of brass wire, which was simply placed upon it, but artistically applied, and held by fastenings of iron wire, so that it enveloped all three holes. A row of heavy stones kept this network down to the floor so that nothing could pass under it. This grating was nothing else than a piece of the brass screens with which aviaries are covered in menageries. Gavroche's bed stood as in a cage behind this net. The whole resembled an Esquimaux tent. This trellis work took the place of curtains. Gavroche moved aside the stones which fastened the net down in front, and the two folds of the net which lapped over each other fell apart. "Down on all fours, brats," said Gavroche. He made his guests enter the cage with great precaution, then he crawled in after them, pulling the stones together, and closed the opening hermetically again. All three had stretched out on the mat. Gavroche still had the cellar rat in his hand. "Now," said he, "go to sleep. I'm going to suppress the candelabra." "Monsieur," the elder of the brothers asked Gavroche, pointing to the netting, "what's that for?" "That," answered Gavroche gravely,